Nick, parasites that affect human health and meat quality.
Yeah, so we're mainly talking, there's three main ones really to talk about. A couple everyone will know as soon as I mention the name. Sheep measles, which is the biggie, and then we've got false hydatids, which we don't hear much of these days, thank goodness, and another one that's everyone will recognise but we don't hear hardly anything of these days, which is also a major relief, is hydatids. And all of those parasites are controlled fairly well by intervening with the biology of the parasite. And I guess the importance of this discussion today, or this little chat today, is to keep that practice of feeding dogs appropriately at the forefront. So yeah, very, very important. And obviously when I mention hydatids, everyone immediately will recognise, hopefully, the important human health aspects to that, as opposed to sheep measles, where there's a lot of losses in the meat industry. And unfortunately, we still, when we look at the numbers of affected carcasses and properties month to month, there still is a bit of a problem there, and in some regions of New Zealand it's escalating, in fact.
Really? How do we get rid of hydatids? Because we used to have dog dosing strips and...
Yeah, so hydatids, we are currently classified as free of hydatids, but this is the time that we really need to be very vigilant to maintain that status. It would be tragic if such a horrible, debilitating and life-threatening disease came back. And as you mentioned, and there used to be the old song on the hydatid strip and Dunsandle,
yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right. Well, that was part of the control policy, and that involved ensuring that working dogs were, by law, and actually all dogs by law, were actually dosed or treated with a drug that would kill the tapeworm. The adult part of the parasite cycle was a tapeworm which lives in the dog. It can be killed through drug therapy, but it became recognised fairly early on that by controlling the adult parasite alone, we weren't going to get control of this problem, and we needed to step in the actual life cycle, which involved dogs getting access to affected offal from sheep or other species of farm animal, and ingesting those cysts, and then from the cysts the adult tapeworm would progress and take hold in the gut, and then have fertilised eggs being dispersed onto the pasture, which would then be ingested by one of the farm species, and then the cyst would be passed on that way. And if you're an unlucky human being, you'd get access to either one of these eggs or a cyst itself. By appropriate feeding, and that means either freezing material from these affected animals for up to 10 days prior to feeding, or actually rendering them, in other words heating them to over 90 degrees, that would render these cysts ineffective, or non-infective and non-dangerous. And so practicing good feeding practices when we're dealing with the dogs on the farm was integral in eliminating this problem. And this is, I guess, why I'm speaking about this today, because just to bring this to the forefront, perhaps it's less of a problem these days with the onset of farmers perhaps using commercial brands of food more regularly than they used to, but there's still a lot of mutton and offal fed, and I guess so it's really, really important that they're fed in a fit state, that we're going to prevent that.
Pick up your dead sheep.
Absolutely, and it minimise any possibility of scavenging and these sort of things. And you know what? The exact same mechanism is the same mechanism that both false hydatids and sheep measles has passed. And so by practicing those feeding methods, we're going to control all of these three parasites very, very effectively. There is a blood test available too for dogs, and so if on a property you start getting notification from abattoirs or freezing works that you've got carcasses affected with sheep measles, for instance, and you're not 100% sure whether things have been gold standard on your own property, you can test your dogs and make sure they're clean. And of course, visiting dogs, if you're on more extensive properties where people are accessing the countryside, then you really need to, you're within your rights to insist that they come certificated that their dogs have been recently treated before coming onto your property.
C. bovis.
C. bovis, I did put it down as something to talk about briefly. There has been in recent times a case. It's the equivalent of sheep measles, which is seen in cattle. It generally affects muscles around the face, tongue and cheek muscles, and so it can be an economically debilitating issue for the beef industry. The interesting thing, and we probably don't want to go into too much depth, is that the primary host isn't the dog. The adult tapeworm for C. bovis is a human, and there was some implication that with a lot of dairy workers getting access to the countryside, that maybe these people had come from countries with less intense animal health practices than we have ourselves, and so the implication was that with this, at least with this recent outbreak, that somehow there had been access by grazing cattle to pasture that had somehow been contaminated with infected pasture from human faeces, whether that be from a septic tank overflow or whatever the case. It means that somehow there'd been people infected with the tapeworm that had been in that vicinity. So I guess it just puts it out there that, you know, we need to be careful of hygiene and making sure that if we get such incidents such as an overflow or a sewage issue, that, you know, it is important to restrict grazing animals that are going to get into the human food chain, that we're protecting that and being sensible about things like that.
In a sad way, that's probably common sense, but common sense doesn't always prevail, does it?
That's right. And if there's, you know, Murphy's Law will state if there's any little chance of something happening, it's going to happen. So it's better just to make sure that the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted when it comes to good practice, when it comes to these kind of things.
Where does worming fit into all this?
Regular worming is, I guess, as I mentioned earlier, relatively important. These days we're less intent on ensuring the old 6-weekly high data dosing. That, I guess, definitely would, at that frequency, even though it seems very high, the frequency, it wouldn't have been frequent enough to totally eradicate any of these problems. And so we still advocate just regular treatment, and as I say, if you're going to be going into the countryside, any people in maybe a semi-rural or an urban environment that get access to farmland to do their recreational activities, if your dogs are involved in that, it would be good practice and actually, to be honest, good manners to ensure that your dog's been dosed very recently and you come with a signed certificate from your veterinarian, so that if you're questioned by the landowner, that you can actually show that your dog has recently been dosed and there's no risk to their livestock in regard to any of these problems we've just talked about today.
I mean, briefly, some of these dog parks where people are exercising, you can let them all go and they have a wonderful time. I mean, that's going to be a bit...
Of course, when the access to the parasite is directly from feces, and that doesn't involve these problems we've just talked about. The access for the problem with the dog and these problems is actually access to meat and offal, but there are other parasites, roundworms of dogs and things, that the contamination source is feces of other dogs. And so, yeah, obviously when they're in environments like that, regular dosing is the way to control those parasites.
Nick, thank you very much indeed.